Have you ever jolted awake in the middle of the night, your heart pounding, because of a sound you couldn't quite name? Was it only the wind? Or was it footsteps out in the wilderness? Just one faint knock against a plank of wood can be enough to send a man bolt upright, his hand locked on a rifle. And if that moment came for you, would you open the door and face whatever waited? Or would you sit in silence and let the dark reveal the intruder on its own? Before I take you deeper, let me speak straight to you, especially those of you who've lived long enough to know that peace is never free. If what you've heard so far stirs something in your chest, hit that like button so I know I'm not telling this tale alone. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. Maybe a quiet porch, maybe a still room. And I promise you this, by the end of the story, you won't only feel the edge of fear, but you'll see a light, a choice, a rebirth, set against the harsh backdrop of the American West. His name was Elias Ward. Folks called him a Confederate veteran, a survivor of fires that had swallowed too many men whole. But survival didn't mean ease. Elias knew better than most war leaves scars. And the deepest scar is a man's unwillingness to ever let down his guard. Every night was the same. He never slept easy, only lay there with his senses sharpened, like some wild animal that knows predators still roam nearby. His cabin stood alone on the Montana plains, where the wind tore through the gaps in old timber walls, seeping in no matter how many times he plastered them with mud. When the gusts rose, the whole place groaned as though someone were creeping outside. A common man might dismiss it, say it was only weather. But Elias heard danger in every scrape and creak. It was the same gift, or curse, that had saved him years ago, catching the whisper of a twig underfoot, the rush of breath in the dark, moments before blades and bullets came for him. Now, at 41, he hadn't shaken the habit. A rifle lay within arm's reach beside his bed. A Colt revolver hung on the peg near the door. Even if he dozed, one sound was enough to bring him bolt upright, finger ready on the trigger. Townfolk called him jumpy, but that jumpiness had kept him alive long after better men had fallen. Out here, law was often no faster than the man who drew first. The cabin wasn't much, 4 wooden walls, a table, a couple of chairs, a stove, and a rough cot. Yet to Elias it was a fortress. He knew the whine of every hinge, the sag of every loose board, could trace each creak in the floorboards in the dark. Out here, no stranger walked into another man's home without risking a bullet. That was why silence itself felt heavy, because when it lasted too long, it was easier to imagine sounds no one wanted to hear. Montana nights in December cut like steel. Elias lay awake, eyes open though the dark pressed thick all around. He heard the wind, the cabin timbers snapping, even his own heartbeat, when his lid slipped shut for a moment. The old memories came rushing, the sight of a comrade falling asleep and never waking, the sound of horses charging unseen through morning fog. Those ghosts kept him from ever closing his eyes for long. His fear never really left him, not the shallow kind of fear, but the deep-rooted kind that becomes instinct. He feared strangers stepping out of nowhere, feared a knock in the night, feared some unseen hand ripping away what little piece he had carved out for himself. And that very fear set him apart. People in town rarely saw him. Every few weeks he rode in, traded coffee and bullets, then slipped away toward the hills. They said Elias Ward was like a ghost of Montana, a silent rider carrying the weight of shadows. But tonight, when the wind slipped through the cracks and the floor groaned under something heavier than weather, Elias knew he wasn't just hearing the storm. His hand gripped the rifle, muscles drawn tight, his breath slowed, his eyes fixed on the dark. There was something out there, or someone. And it was in that moment, friends, that our story truly begins. Do you remember that uneasy feeling when the wind suddenly dies? leaving behind another sound, small, but sharp enough to freeze your spine for Elias Ward. That night wasn't only the wind. He heard the porch boards creak, a faint breath pressed too tight, and then the door eased open with the softest shift. Elias sprang upright, his hand already locked around the rifle. For a heartbeat he waited, expecting a door to crash wide. Instead, there was silence. He struck a match and lit the lantern, its weak flame throwing long shadows across the walls. Then, behind him, came the faintest rustle. Elias swung around, barrel raised. What he saw wasn't an armed intruder, but a slight figure curled beneath his own blanket on the cot. His chest went tight. A stranger. No. A young woman. She was pressed against the far wall, shivering like a cornered animal. In the glow of the lantern he saw her clearly bronzed skin, black hair falling in wild tangles over her shoulders, wide dark eyes filled with dread. Apache. No doubt. Her bare feet were torn and blistered, streaked with dried blood around a swollen ankle. Her dress was shredded, ripped high up the thigh, the bodice torn open enough to show dust across her collarbone. Faint bruises colored her arms. She carried the smell of smoke, sweat, and miles of running. For one instant, Elias's instinct was to bark a curse, drag her out, and throw her back into the night. This was his bed, his last stronghold in a world that had already stripped him of too much. To find someone hiding under his blanket felt like trespass of the worst kind. But she didn't beg. She didn't cry or protest. She only looked at him, silent, waiting for whatever he chose to do. That silence stopped him cold. If she had pleaded, he could have hardened his heart. If she had lied, he could have turned to stone. Instead, she just waited. The seconds stretched, each one marked by the harsh pounding of his own pulse. At last, Elias muttered a curse under his breath, lowered the rifle, and snatched an extra wool blanket from the chair. He tossed it at her with a motion sharper than he intended. "Stay put," he growled. "Don't touch me." She flinched, then slowly pulled the blanket around her trembling frame. Her fingers shook so hard it was a wonder she held on at all. Elias snuffed the match, leaving the lantern's low flame to paint the room in dull gold. He sat down on the edge of the cot, rifle laid across his knees. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks. Inside, there were only two sounds, the groan of the wood in the cold and the unsteady breaths of the girl in his bed. The fear wasn't only hers anymore. It crawled into Elias, too, as he realized he'd just allowed a mystery into his stronghold. Someone had driven her here. That much was certain. A woman doesn't stumble half-naked and bleeding into a stranger's cabin unless someone or something hunts her hard. And if those hunters followed the trail, this cabin would become a battleground. He could throw her out at dawn, wash his hands clean, let her meet whatever fate waited. But the image of her raw, bleeding feet and bruised shoulders gnawed at him. He had seen men cut down on battlefields, but he had never been the one to shove a broken soul back toward death. So he kept his vigil. The long night stretched, Elias sitting rigid with the rifle across his lap, ears tuned to every shift of wind and every breath the girl drew under the blanket. Neither spoke a word. The silence pressed heavy enough to make each heartbeat sound like a drum. Morning crept in gray and brittle, the kind of light that sharpened the chill instead of easing it. By force of habit, Elias's hand closed on the rifle the instant he stirred. His eyes flicked to the cot. She was still there, a small bundle under wool, black hair spilling tangled across her face. Last night, fear had swallowed the room whole. This morning, despair hung heavier her despair, worn like a second skin. And Elias knew with a kind of certainty that from the moment she'd crossed his threshold, he was no longer alone. Picture it in your own house, on your only bed. A stranger has slipped beneath your blanket as if it belonged to her. The fury rose hot in Elias Ward's chest, flaring like coals struck by wind. He wanted to shout, to seize the girl and toss her straight out into the winter dark, to reclaim the little order that was his life. "Damn it," Elias hissed, the rifle trembling in his grip. Every habit of a soldier, every instinct of a survivor, screamed at him, "Remove the threat now." This was his cabin, his bed. No one had the right to intrude. And this girl, an Apache girl, meant nothing but trouble. She stayed curled in the blanket, eyes wide, hands clutching the wool he had thrown her way. No begging, no tears, just silence. That silence stoked his anger all the more. He wanted words, excuses, something he could rail against. Instead, she waited, eyes fixed on him, bearing the weight of whatever he might decide. Elias lowered the rifle, though his glare stayed sharp. He crossed to a wooden chest, yanked it open, and pulled out a battered tin kit. Inside were an old jar of salve and a few strips of clean cloth. His hands were rough, scarred, but his motions carried the precision of a man long used to patching wounds, human or animal. "Give me your foot," he snapped. She hesitated, then inched out her bare feet. Blood-crusted, cracked, swollen. Elias scowled. The smell of iron and dust rose off her skin, making his stomach tighten with distaste. "Why am I doing this?" he thought bitterly. "She brings danger to my door, and here I am tending her like a fool." His touch was harsher than it needed to be as he smeared salve into the raw cuts. She winced, breath quick and shallow, but made no sound. Her silence maddened him. He wanted her to cry out, to curse him, anything to justify throwing her back into the night. But she endured, mute and trembling, and that endurance made him feel like the cruel one. When the bandages were tied off, Elias shoved the kit back into the chest with a thud. He stalked to the stove, struck a flame, and set an old pot of beans to heat. The firelight carved lines deep into his lean face. "Eat," he ordered, dropping the bowl onto the table within her reach. She glanced at him, wary, then crawled closer and lifted the bowl with trembling fingers. She ate as if each spoonful were borrowed time, slow at first, then faster, devouring it with the desperation of the starved. Elias turned his face away, but he couldn't shut out the sounds, the scrape of the spoon, the hollow clink of tin, the hurried gulps. Every note of it echoed in the small cabin, stoking his irritation. "What am I doing?" he thought again. He wasn't a merciful man. He had lived on suspicion and steel for years. Yet now, because one Apache girl had slipped beneath his blanket, he sat watching her eat food meant for him. The rifle still lay across his knees, his palm never far from the worn stock. His mind hammered with warning. Be careful. She could be bait. There could be men waiting out there, ready to follow. Don't trust her. Don't you dare. His anger and his suspicion tangled together, setting his pulse on edge. At last, the bowl was empty. She pushed it back toward him, then touched her chest lightly with one hand. Her voice was shaky, but clear enough. "Ahyona." Elias stiffened. He hadn't expected a name, certainly not an introduction. His grip on the rifle tightened, eyes narrowing, breath dragging heavy through his nose. Part of him wanted to snarl, to drive her out right then. But another part softened, though he despised himself for it. That night, for the first time in years, another rhythm of breathing filled the cabin besides his own. Yet the unease clung to him like barbed wire. He knew full well he had opened his door to a storm, and storms never left a man's life untouched. Some of you may know the feeling inside your own home. Everything looks quiet on the surface, but in your chest rises a gnawing question. Does this stranger carry more shadows behind her? For Elias Ward. Every day, after that first night, stretched taut as a drawn wire. The Apache girl Ahyona did not leave when daylight came. Instead, she moved about the cabin as if to prove her presence would not be a burden. At dawn, while Elias struck flint to the stove, she was already carrying in kindling, stacking it neatly by the hearth, when he hammered new boards onto the doorframe. She knelt close by, gathering the nails he dropped. At midday, returning from the stock pen, Elias found her crouched by the table, clumsily stitching the torn sleeve of his shirt with thread from his mending kit. Each act unsettled him. He hadn't asked her to do it. He didn't need anyone to shoulder his chores. Yet her hands brushed across every corner of the cabin, every tool and scrap of cloth that had once been his alone. It felt like trespass, dressed up as helpfulness. Elias watched with narrowed eyes. The rifle always within reach, his body tense, ready for one wrong move. Still, he couldn't miss the signs that told a harsher story. Bruises marked her shoulders, old and new layered together. When her ragged dress slipped, he glimpsed raw scratches across her skin, the kind that came from crawling on rock and gravel. At night, half awake, he sometimes heard her whisper in broken Apache, words cracked with sobs, like prayers to spirits who no longer answered. One afternoon, with sunlight slanting through the boards, Elias broke the silence, his voice gravel rough. "Where'd you run from Ahyona froze?" The needle pricked into the cloth, and she lifted her head. Fear lit her eyes before she finally answered in halting English, heavy with accent from the south. Elias drummed his fingers on the table, gaze sharp. "Is someone following?" She stayed silent so long he thought she might refuse. Then, slowly, she nodded once, just a small motion, but enough to tell him the truth. She had not come here alone. Men were on her trail, and sooner or later, they would ride this way. From that moment, the air in the cabin grew heavier. Elias doubled his vigilance. The rifle never left his side. His horse stayed tied near the door. Each time he stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanned the open grassland, sweeping the horizon for dust trails. Nights became longer, his ears straining at every gust of wind, every creak of timber. He knew it well the girl's presence had turned his shelter into a target. Yet she remained, steady and patient. Morning found her at the fire. By noon she swept the cabin floor, patched his worn clothes, and stacked wood by the door. When Elias split logs, she hauled the smaller pieces. When he mended the corral, she swept the yard with a broken-handled broom. These small gestures didn't erase his suspicion, but they did chip away at the silence that had haunted the cabin for years. One evening, after a meal of beans, she placed her hand lightly against her chest and whispered, "Ahyona, my name." Elias stared, saying nothing. The sound of that name carried more than syllables, it carried the weight of truth. She had lost her family, all of them. Behind her silence lay the hollow grief of someone stripped of kin, of tribe, left to run like prey before the hounds. And now, white men hunted her, intent on finishing what had already been taken. He asked no more questions, but something in his gaze shifted. She was no longer only an intruder. She was a soul driven to the edge. Yet still his soldier's instinct refused to soften. The cabin remained his fortress, its every corner guarded. Only now he guarded her as well, keeping watch not only on the empty plains, but on the fragile figure bent over his shirt by the fire. Day by day, Elias's caution never wavered, but it took on a new shape. His watchfulness was no longer aimed solely at the world beyond the door. It now circled inward, toward something rising in himself, something he wasn't ready to name. Perhaps you've known this feeling. At first you bolt the doors of your heart, but day by day, through small gestures, suspicion softens, and a rare warmth begins to show. Elias Ward had lived for years, trusting only steel and silence. Yet the presence of Ahyona, though it had arrived under the shadow of danger, was slowly reshaping the cabin around him. By day, Elias took her out across the grassland. His horse knew the trail, plodding steady along the fence line that stretched to the foot of the hills. Ahyona rode behind, her hands resting lightly against the back of his coat, watching without a word. At first, Elias stayed tense, half expecting her to bolt the moment he dismounted. But each time he stopped to tighten wire or drive a post, she slipped down too, stooping to gather fallen stakes or hold the line steady while he worked. She asked little, copied his motions clumsily, but her clumsiness was proof enough she wasn't trying to run. She was choosing to stay. By evening, they rode home with the smell of dust and dry grass still clinging to their coats. Elias was used to silent meals alone, but now the rough supper of beans, bread, and black coffee carried the faint music of another spoon tapping against tin. Ahyona ate slowly, no longer like a hunted thing afraid her food would be snatched away. Sometimes her eyes lifted toward him before darting down again, and Elias caught what looked like the shy curve of a smile. At night, the change was sharper still. Elias had kept the cot for her, bedding down on the floor by the door with his rifle at hand. But when the wind shrieked through the cracks and the cold gripped the room, he heard her turning restlessly, shivering under the thin blanket. One evening, he gave a short nod. "Stay on this side. Warmer." She hesitated, then shifted, leaving a clear space between them. Elias lay still, eyes open, feeling the strange warmth of another body nearby. That night, for the first time in years, he slept straight through until morning. In the days that followed, the space between them shrank when the wind moaned louder. She drew closer beneath the covers. When the lantern burned low, her shoulder brushed his. Elias didn't pull away. Instead, he felt the old knot of vigilance in his chest replaced by something gentler, unnamed, but strangely calm. One evening, while Elias sat at the table cleaning his rifle, Ahyona was by the fire, stitching a tear in his work pants. She raised her head, voice quiet but steady. "I can stay." Elias's hand stilled. The question wasn't quite permission-seeking. It was more a test of trust. He studied her for a long time before nodding slowly. "Stay." She didn't smile, only breathed out softly, as though some weight had lifted. From that moment, the cabin was no longer just his fortress. It breathed with two lives now, bound by a thread of trust. Each morning, Elias poured a second cup of coffee, setting it before her without comment. Each evening, she built the fire before he came in from the cold. Their silence was no longer uneasy, but companionable. And when night fell, the narrow cot held them both without that cold gulf of space between. Elias lay with his arm across his chest, his hand brushing the edge of her blanket. Ahyona did not flinch. She closed her eyes and let the quiet trust carry her into sleep. For a man who had thought he would live out his days alone, Elias learned a strange truth sometimes: trust needs no declaration. It shows itself in eyes no longer filled with fear, in hands that no longer tremble, and in the steady breath of another soul beside you through the long western night. Some of you know the moment well. A small trace outside your door can ring louder than any bell. For Elias Ward, that moment came on a gray morning when he rode along the north fence line. In the damp soil, still wet with fog, he saw fresh hoofprints, not his horse's. These were deeper, pressed forward marks of riders who had pushed hard, then stopped sudden. Elias crouched, laid a finger in the print, and felt his blood go cold. They've been close. That afternoon, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Elias stood on the porch, eyes raking the horizon, and then he saw them, two riders, easing closer, their silhouettes sharp against the pale grass. One older, with a trimmed beard and eyes that cut like knives. The other younger, restless, eyes shifting like a man used to hunting. "Good evening," the older one called, voice heavy, testing. Elias stood firm, rifle in hand, not raised, not lowered. "You're a long way from anywhere." The younger man's gaze swept the yard, searching. "We heard a girl came this way. Apache. You seen her?" Elias's reply was flat. "No one here but me." The wind fell dead. Silence weighed thick, raising the hair on his neck. The bearded man's mouth twitched into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Funny. We heard different." Elias's finger settled lightly on the trigger, heart slow but pounding hard. "Then you heard wrong. Trail's that way." He nodded toward the open plain. "Right at before dark." The two men exchanged a look, silent words passing. At last the older one spat into the dirt. "This ain't finished." "Ward." They turned their horses, riding off slow, dust curling in the dusk. Elias held his aim until their shapes shrank to specks against the hills. Inside, Ahyona stood in the middle of the room, her hands gripping her shawl. Her eyes asked the question, her lips didn't. Did they go? Ellis nodded, though his voice was like stone. "For now. They'll be back." She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She only drew a long breath and said quietly, "I will be ready." From that night, the cabin became a fortress. Elias checked every corner, rifles cleaned, rounds sorted into easy-to-grab packs. He dug a shallow pit near the barn to hide extra wood, sealed cracks in the walls so the lantern's glow wouldn't spill out into the dark. Ahyona no longer moved like a silent guest. She trained under his eye. Elias showed her how to work the Winchester's lever, how to listen to wind against grass, how to lie flat so the moon wouldn't catch her shape. At first her hands trembled when she chambered around, but within days, her motions grew sharper, her eyes steadier. Evenings found them by the small fire, speaking little but planning much. Elias told her how to scatter dirt to hide tracks around the porch. Ahyona sorted food stores, beans, cornmeal, dried meat so they could last weeks if trapped inside. Fear hung in the cabin like smoke that wouldn't clear. Yet along with it ran a taut thread binding them together. Two souls, once strangers, now fixed on the same doorway, waiting for the sound of hooves. At night, when they lay on the narrow cot, Elias no longer held himself apart. One hand rested always near his rifle, but the other brushed the blanket she clutched. Her warmth crept through, easing the drum of his heart. In the dark, she whispered, "If they come back, I will not run." Elias was silent for a moment, then answered, voice iron low, "Then we'll stand together." Outside, the wind rose again, moaning across the plains like a warning. But inside that cabin, two lives had woven into a single line of defense. In the grip of fear and tension, a new bond was forged not only of affection, but of survival. Perhaps you've known this scene yourself. The sky looks calm, yet inside you hear the pounding of an alarm. For Elias Ward. It came on a bitter afternoon when dust still clung to the air and the sound of hooves thundered from the south. He stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowing. This time it wasn't two riders, it was three. They rode straight into the yard, faces set hard, their intent clear. One swung down, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The bearded man, the one who had come before, strode forward, voice grinding through clenched teeth. "We told you. Ward, this time she leaves with us." Elias didn't flinch. His rifle was already firm in his hands. He walked slowly to the gate, putting the narrow fence between himself and the riders. The wind snapped his coat, dust curling around his boots. He dipped the barrel down for a moment, then raised it again, thumbed back the hammer. The sharp click carried louder than thunder. "One more step," he said evenly, "and a man won't be riding home." Silence stretched tight. The younger rider's horse tossed its head, pawing the dirt. Inside the cabin. Ahyona crouched by the doorframe, Winchester braced against her shoulder. She angled the barrel through a crack in the wood, her eyes wide but steady. The younger man sneered when he saw the glint of steel. "Got a woman pointing a gun at us." Now Elias's reply was like a command, barked on a battlefield. "She's not alone." He squeezed the trigger. The shot blasted dirt a hand's width from the younger man's boot, spraying dust into his face. The crack echoed across the prairie, sending a flock of crows wheeling black into the sky. The riders jerked back, anger flashing to hesitation. From inside came the sharp clack of Ahyona chambering around. The sound was clear, defiant. Her dark eyes glinted through the narrow gap, no longer only frightened, but resolved. For a long breath, nothing moved but the wind tugging at coats and manes. Then the bearded man squinted hard at Elias, weighing pride against death. At last he spat into the dirt and jerked his chin. "Let's ride." Slowly they turned, pulling back their reins. Hooves struck heavy as they left, but their eyes burned holes in the cabin as they went. Elias held his rifle raised until the three dwindled to specks on the gray horizon. Only then did he let his shoulders ease, sweat cold down his back. When he stepped inside, Ahyona was still at the door, rifle raised, her knuckles white around the stock. She looked at him, her eyes filled with something fierce and unspoken fear. Yes, but pride, too. Elias gave a slow nod. "Good." She lowered the rifle, breath ragged, but lifted her chin with the steel of someone who had crossed a line and would not go back. In that moment, Elias knew they were no longer strangers under one roof. They were partners, bound by danger. That night the cabin felt heavy with silence. Elias sat cleaning each rifle, checking cartridges, laying them out neat as a soldier at war. Ahyona sat by the fire, oiling the Winchester with steady hands. They didn't waste words. They didn't need to. The quiet between them had changed. It was no longer wary, but united. When at last they lay down on the narrow cot, Elias could still feel the tension thrumming in the air. His hand rested near the rifle at his side, but his other hand found hers under the blanket. For the first time, she did not pull away. Her fingers curled gently around his. Outside, the prairie wind keened like a warning yet to come, but inside the cabin, two souls had chosen to stand side by side. And that bond, tempered in danger, sealed in trust, was stronger than any bullet, my friends. Those of you who have lived long enough know this truth: no storm lasts forever, and no fear endures that dawn cannot wash away. Yet for a man who has lived too long in dread, the return of peace can feel strange, like a bird once tossed through tempests, now trembling to spread its wings beneath a calm sky. That was the place Elias Ward found himself, and with him, the young Apache woman called Ahyona. After that final standoff, the three riders turned back, leaving the yard in a haze of dust. Elias held his rifle high until their silhouettes melted into the far hills. When he stepped inside, Ahyona was still gripping her Winchester, her eyes wide and fixed. Only when he gave a slow nod, "They're gone," did she lower the gun. Her shoulders sagging as if a weight she had carried for too long had at last slipped away. In that moment, Elias stepped close and set a calloused hand upon her shoulder. She leaned against his chest without a word, her arms circling him tight. Her breath was quick, her heart racing against his ribs. Elias understood then some battles are not fought for land or shelter, but to preserve the soul of another human being. That night the cabin changed. No scraping of gun barrels, no restless pacing across the floorboards, only the crackle of firewood and the warmth of two bodies at rest. For Elias, it was the first sleep in years not broken by nightmares. Morning light seeped through the cracks, pale and pink. Elias woke as he always did, but instead of the lonesome wind, he heard the steady breathing beside him. Turning, he saw Ahyona curled in the blanket, her face calm in the glow. He rose softly, brewed coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. Soon, she joined him, a blanket draped across her shoulders, bare feet on the damp boards. She said nothing, only stood beside him as the sun climbed over the distant ridges. For the first time, Elias did not feel small under that endless sky. He felt steadied, as though the land itself had promised, "This is home." No longer a fortress of solitude, but a shared dwelling. In the days that followed, the cabin bore a new life. Elias still rode fence lines and checked stock, but when he returned, smoke curled from the chimney and the smell of cornbread hung in the air. The scratch of a needle echoed softly as Ahyona mended cloth by the fire. She was no longer merely a guest. She was half of something whole. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, drying herbs she had gathered from the creek bed. She spoke haltingly in broken English of the family she had lost, of memories scattered in the South. Elias didn't speak much, but his eyes stayed with her, as if to say her grief would rest here, not follow her any further. By night, they sat before the fire in silence, not the uneasy silence of strangers, but the warm quiet of trust. When the flames died, Elias drew her close, and they knew then they had chosen each other not out of circumstance, but because each was the other's way out of darkness. My friends, perhaps you too have stood at such a crossroads. Some choose to turn back, clutching the safety of solitude. Others dare to open the door and find renewal at the very edge of despair. Elias Ward, once a soldier who trusted nothing but a rifle, chose the latter. That choice turned a cold, drafty cabin into a home. And now, I ask you, what would you have done after years of silence? Would you have the courage to take the trembling hand offered to you? Scarred though it may be, if this story stirs your heart, press that like button. Show the world you believe that even in the harshest corners of the American West, humanity and love can take root. And share your thoughts below should Elias keep this cabin as their lasting refuge, or lead Ahyona towards new horizons where they can build a broader future, I promise you. This tale does not end here. True peace is not simply the absence of gunfire. It is the decision to build something lasting. Elias and Ahyona must choose remain watchful defenders on the edge of the plains, or gather their courage to shape a new life together. But tonight, let us pause within this quiet. Let us rest in the image of a Montana sunset, golden over the grasslands, where two souls once lost now hold each other and call that weathered cabin home.